Ugh, my stitching on the inside of this is so messy.
Who cares? It's the inside. No one's gonna see it.
Yeah, I guess you're right.
Excuse me, I need to check your seams. Are you planning on finishing these seam allowances by hand?
I don't have time for that! I need to wear this in 2 days!
So, I personally won't wear anything that isn't correctly finished. I always make time to do my sewing right.
Then what do I do?
Just machine finish them. You've got an overcasting stitch, that'll take care of it.
You're right, I do.
Won't be historically accurate.
Wait, your sewing machine can overcast seams? Gimme!
Well, since I might not be getting my machine back anytime soon, we might as well sit down for a chat. And honestly, costuming community, I think we're overdue for this one. We gotta talk about perfectionism in historical sewing. We might have some seriously incorrect ideas about how sewists and dressmakers through history saw their work, and some equally incorrect ideas about what that means for us as costumers in the present day, who have things like machine overcasting. Or did, until their machines got swiped by overworked dressmaking apprentices from the 19th century. Hi, I'm V. Fashion historian, historical dressmaker, and unashamed user of every bit of modern sewing technology I can figure out. Here at SnappyDragon Studios, we want historical costuming to be joyful and accessible. That's the whole point, isn't it? To have fun playing dress up. But recently, I've seen a lot of folks on the internet being down on themselves about not doing something the right way. Pinning every gather, having perfectly hand-felled seams, sewing at 20 stitches per inch. The sort of perfection we're constantly told is historically accurate. And of course, being historically accurate is the most important thing. Now, I am a sucker for beautifully even gathers and clean invisible finishes and loads of hand sewing, when my carpal tunnel doesn't decide to go all bet you thought you'd seen the last of me. But is it actually historically accurate? And does it matter to us costumers making stuff in the world of overlock machines? I'm not so sure. And everything from antique dresses to Victorian housework manuals says there might be more to it. So here's the thing. For many, many centuries, until industrialization took over, clothing was made by two categories of people. First, you have the professionals, tailors and mantua makers and such, who sew full-time for a living and for much of history were only employed to make certain high-status or complicated garments. And then you have homemakers. The people, historically mostly women, for whom sewing was just one of the massive number of tasks necessary to keep the people they lived with fed, warm, and as comfortable as their resources allowed. This was hard. There's a study from the journal Science Advances that analyzed the remains of prehistoric to early medieval European peasant women and discovered that they probably had stronger arms than modern, competitive rowers. Speaking of studies, if you like source notes and citations and such, you should join my Patreon, because I put my entire bibliographies up there. And... Fine, and subscribe. You know the drill. Even as technology advanced, it could often take all the hours you had in the day and more to feed everyone, care for the living space, do any income generating work you needed to do, and everything else that was, and in many cases still is, expected of homemakers. You might like sewing and enjoy doing it. Plenty of people today like cooking for their households and enjoy doing it. But it's still housework, not a creative hobby the way it is for many of us. So the mentality is totally different. The important thing was that you made or maintained clothes that functioned, that didn't fall apart any sooner than could be avoided, that kept your household warm and covered and hopefully looking respectable. Sure, tight small stitches and well-finished seams mattered because you needed the clothes not to fall apart, not because they were pretty and perfect. When you've got to do all this housework with medieval or even Victorian technology, it's a huge amount of labor. Heck, I live by myself in a modern house with modern technology, and I still feel like housework is endless. Of course, people wanted to develop ways to make it easier, and that meant inventing and using labor-saving devices. How many of us use dishwashers or vacuum cleaners or laundry machines? These make housework about 1 million times more doable. And if you doubt me, please go watch this video about how medieval laundry day is one of the few things about medieval history that is as bad as the myths say it is. I don't know about you, but as long as my dishwasher cleans my dishes fully, I don't feel bad for using it, as long as I don't do anything unsuitable like putting cast iron through it. When you recognize that sewing was a form of housework, sewing machines fall into the same category. As soon as they could get them, 19th century homemakers started using machines for everything they possibly could. Marna Davis's book, No Lady of Leisure, one of my favorite fashion history books on working class clothes, contains a number of 19th century antique dresses that were mostly or completely machine made. All this to say, when sewing was part of your endless household to-do list, you got it done the fastest way possible that wouldn't sacrifice quality. If you could use a machine, of course you would. If you finished your seams as fast as you could rather than as prettily, that was 5 or 10 or 20 minutes you bought yourself for other work. Or just to put your feet up at the end of the day. But if you've been around the historical sewing internet for long, you've probably seen folks trying to learn sewing techniques the way people in the past did, including from Victorian sewing books. We do love our primary sources here, but we also love context. And for these books, context matters. During the 19th century, sewing was considered the sort of basic life skill that was learned at home from childhood. Like, most of us do not remember being formally taught how to sweep a floor, although we must have learned at some point. These books were intended to teach young sewists good habits, either being read by the sewists themselves or by their parents to help teach them. So they describe an ideal, the right way to sew something under circumstances where everything goes well and time and budget are not concerns. And some of these earlier books give super fundamental basic advice. The 1843 book Ladies' Handbook of Millinery, Dressmaking, and Tatting talks about how dressing up dolls is the best place for children to start learning good sewing skills. Even in the sections on making dresses for actual humans, the book feels the need to inform you that you should be careful not to sew any of your skirt panels together upside down. But they're practical instructions and read like it. You should also make sure your fastenings are so strongly sewn your dress will wear out before your stitching does. The corresponding Ladies' Handbook of Plain Needlework, another in the series, gives a lot of stitching directions using threads as measurements. This makes them seem tiny and super precise until you consider the difference between threads in wool flannel versus fine muslin. It's a good way to have stitches vary with the fineness of your fabric. And Bertha Banner's book, Household Sewing with Home Dressmaking, specifies that in fine materials with smaller threads, you should roughly double the number. Also, this is meant to train your eye and your hand, rather than suggesting anyone's gonna be counting the threads in your stitches outside of a schoolroom setting. Even in a schoolroom setting, such as in Agnes Walker's Manual of Needlework and Cutting Out, a book written to help teachers plan sewing and knitting lessons. She says, "If there be any danger more likely to be incurred than another in teaching sewing, it is that of straining the eyesight of the pupils by the use of too fine textures and the production of microscopic stitches." And this utility over pretty insides mentality is supported by looking at the guts of antique clothes. It can be tricky to find photos of the inside of extant garments, since your average person going to a museum is more interested in the pretty outsides than in all the internal stuff. But there's a number from the 19th century in Linda Setnick's book, Victorian Fashions for Women and Children. I like that these are photos of regular people's clothes, rather than really high-class stuff that isn't representative of what most people wore. Raw or barely finished seam allowances were super common, especially on sleeves, and in dresses made from materials that would be spot cleaned rather than washed. There's lots of machine stitching for the construction, and often for the finishing too. Even when you see hand finishing on the inside, it's not always neat. These early 1860s dresses have big visible running stitches on the inside. I'm guessing 2 or 3 to the inch. This late 1870s bodice is fully lined, yes, but there are loose thread ends all over the inside. Another late 1870s or early 80s dress, this time a higher fashion one for a child, has complicated shirring on the outside and chaotic stitching to secure that shirring all over the inside. And look at the huge felling stitches on this mid-1880s bustle dress. Again, these are maybe 2 or 3 to the inch, and this on a fairly classy silk dress with cut velvet decoration. As for work and working class dresses, No Lady of Leisure has some great photos of those antique dresses from Marna Davis's collection. The finishing is all over the place, including one example of aligning pieced together from different fabrics, some small but very visible hand stitching on a collar, and machine finished hems with bias binding made from leftover fabric. One gorgeous bright red wrapper dress is partially lined with an old feed sack, complete with some of the label. Going a little further back, Nora Woe's book The Cut of Women's Clothes describes the finishing on 18th century dresses as being rough by modern standards. The fitted lining would be cut out of a sturdy, cheaper linen canvas and the edges left raw, while the good outer material was pleated into shape with the edges cut in a lot fewer places. When construction changed in the 1770s to seamed bodices rather than pleated ones, that is when you start to see actual edge finishing because the good material had raw edges too. Okay, but what about professional dressmakers? Starting in the late 17th century and increasing dramatically through the 19th, more and more people were having some items of their wardrobe made by professionals. Depending on your budget, this could mean anything from bringing a length of the best fabric you could possibly afford to the village mantua maker for your one good jacket, to having most of your going out clothes made by someone else. Professional dressmakers had a slightly different set of considerations. Quality was important, as dissatisfied customers were bad for business then as now. But the more work you could complete, the more you got paid. So speed was important too, and a balance had to be found. Some of that efficiency came through a division of labor. The trickier work that required more experience, cutting, fitting, drapery, would be done by highly practiced workers. Simpler work, such as basting, straight seams, and finishing raw edges, would be done by the less experienced workers, or by apprentices who weren't being paid in money. Some of this low-skill work could even be contracted out as piecework to the lowest status workers a business could use. When researching the Lower East Side garment industry to reconstruct an outfit from my great-great-grandmother's time there, I came across stories of immigrant women who would take in work basting garments together so they could be sewn up by the factories. Click up there if you want to hear the whole story. Much of that apprentice or low-skill work is the stuff we now use machines to do. On my modern sewing projects, the fastest part is usually sewing the pieces together. It's the pattern making and cutting that takes the most time and precision. The finishing work can also depend a lot on the price point of the garment. Our collection of extant garments, particularly ones in museums, lean toward higher cost items because ordinary working people couldn't afford to preserve their clothes rather than wearing them out and repurposing the material. Also because ordinary people's clothes have long been considered too commonplace and not glitzy enough to warrant preservation in a museum. So of course an expensive silk evening dress worn by some famous person or made by some famous designer is going to have fancier finishing than a plain cotton work dress. Meanwhile, mass-produced items, even from the 19th century, would have as much machine finishing as possible so they could be mass-produced in factories. Homemade clothes might have more hand finishing, or none at all, depending on the maker's access to a sewing machine. And the finishing will be strong rather than pretty. Here's a shot of a circa 1886 dress by Mrs. C. Peterson of New York in silk with lace and beadwork trim. Definitely a pricey outfit. It's got large, uneven herringbone stitching over the label, as well as large and visible running stitches on the inside finishing. Certain materials actually do require more careful finishing work than others. Even today, we're more likely to see French seams used on a silk blouse than a cotton one. This photo of an 1893 Robina evening gowns label shows some of the seam finishing, and while the seam allowances have been carefully pinked and hand overcast to prevent fraying, the stitches are still huge, and they're just out there, visible on the inside of the dress, rather than being hidden or even covered with a lining. Even at the pinnacle of 19th century Western couture, everyone understood that fine finishing was only useful up to a certain point. And speaking of leaving seam allowances out and visible on the inside of a garment, there's a purpose to that too. Alterations. People change size. And given the cost of materials and the labor involved in making clothes, replacing your whole wardrobe when that happened wasn't something anyone would want to do. If the seam allowances are accessible, a bit large, and gently finished, it's less work for the dressmaker when you bring something back to be adjusted 2 years in a pregnancy later. Why waste time on pretty finishing when it might need to be ripped out and redone? And why make more work for your future self who's got to do that ripping out? A good dressmaker might even leave the seam allowances like this on purpose, making it a feature rather than a bug. But we are not 19th century dressmakers. We are not 17th century homemakers. If you're watching this video, unless you're an archaeologist or historian far in the future, in which case, hi! I hope I didn't leave anything about the 2020s confusingly vague. You're a 21st century person, and sewing costumes is probably not your job. So what does all of this mean for us? For me, it's not about learning the right way and only doing that, but nor is it about ignoring the satisfaction that can come from a beautiful, perfectly done garment. And it's about not applying my standards for my projects to anyone else, or even to my other projects. For instance, I'm a sucker for a clean finish, especially on historical pieces, and I recently made myself a new summer weight dressing gown to replace one that I was wearing out after 3 years. I could have just top stitched the trim around the edges, but I hate the way my top stitching looks. Probably doesn't help that my top stitching is messy. So I hand felled all the trim down to the lining on the inside. It took hours. It was not necessary, and I would never tell anyone else they should do this, but it made me personally happy with it. Conversely, I made the madcap decision to sew a new 21st century dress for an event last weekend in under a week, and my goodness, this thing is slapped together. It's stretch knit. Raw edges everywhere, completely unfinished hemline, but I am heckin' pleased with it and it looks exactly as I want it to. A little bit of perfectionism can be good when it makes for a satisfying project, but it shouldn't ever ruin your enjoyment of something you're making for your own satisfaction. You might have heard the phrases, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and don't let the perfect be the enemy of the done. So here's my addition. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the fun. As I say so often, we are all just here to play dress up. This is a hobby and a source of joy. The important part is that we do enjoy it. So this is your permission to do your historical sewing projects in a way that isn't the right way. And also a reminder that you do not need my permission or anyone else's. What matters is that it works for you. That you get what you want out of making things. If you love researching and constructing with original practice methods, if that is what makes you happy, go for it. And if you use random thrifted fabrics and serge your edges and slap together patterns on the floor, I applaud you. And everything in between. I am here for the people who hand-stitch seams and machine finish edges, for the folks machine sewing with cotton thread, for the folks whose goals change with every project. These are your projects and your clothes, and no one else from any century should get to make you think you're doing them wrong. What matters to me is making costuming fun and accessible, so I hope this video helps you feel more pride and joy in the things you make. Please do send this video around to your sewing friends and groups, whether they're fellow costumers who may be suffering from externally imposed perfectionism, or that one person who might be imposing in their perfectionism. Tell me in the comments about your favorite way to sew that is not supposedly perfect. Click the button to tell YouTube you liked what you saw, and subscribe for more fashion history sass with a side of aggressively supportive encouragement. You are great, and the things you make are great, and I look forward to seeing you around the internet. You can find me at Miss SnappyDragon on Instagram, Facebook, and very occasionally TikTok, and you can find source notes and behind-the-scenes content at patreon.com/SnappyDragonStudios. See you next time, assuming I can get the chaos that is my next research project to sound coherent. Hey, is that negative self-talk I hear? Stop it!